Hi, welcome to the Crocker Science Center. My name's David Thomas and I'm the manager of the educational laboratory facilities here at the center. You, as a student, if you're watching this video, are probably going to be taking a laboratory course in one of our great lab facilities here. Now, whether this is your first time taking a course here or your third or fourth, there's a few things that we need to make sure that you're aware of as you're preparing for your lab. First, as you can see behind me, we have a great set of laboratory facilities. Beautiful, new, state-of-the-art. We all have to work together to keep them that way. So a few things that you can do to help us out. First of all, one thing is that you can clean up your spills. Right? If you spill something in the lab, make sure that you clean that up. And if you don't know how to do that safely, talk with your TA or your instructor, but do make sure that it gets taken care of. Any equipment that you're using, when you're done with it or at the end of the lab for the day, make sure that you put that back wherever you got it from. Leave the space as nice for the next student as it was, or better than it was, when you came in. And lastly, let's make sure that we leave the laboratories in a state that's safe for others to enter and walk through the labs. This especially applies to our custodial staff. We want to make sure that we don't put them at any unnecessary risk. I want to take just a few minutes to now talk about what's called PPE, or personal protective equipment. Now, the level and amount of PPE that is required will vary from course to course and is ultimately determined by your instructor. However, there are some general PPE discussion points that we can go over right now that are good to think about as you're preparing for a laboratory course. First, you might have noticed I'm not wearing any personal protective equipment. So let's see if we can fix that. There. That's better. Now you'll notice that I'm wearing several pieces of what we call PPE, or personal protective equipment. The actual personal protective equipment that would be required for your particular lab course will be determined by your instructor, because every lab course has different hazards associated with it, and therefore we need to modify the PPE required to match those hazards. So talk to your instructor about the particular PPE required for your course. That being said, there's still some general things that we need to talk about regarding PPE. First, your general attire. Okay, maybe you think of PPE as only lab coats and gloves and goggles, but what you wear to the lab, just your basic clothing, can be important in protecting you from certain hazards. So for instance, the more skin you cover, the better. Right? So if you're working with a strong acid and you have exposed skin, if you spill that acid, it'd be much better for that to get onto pants or a shirt or something than directly on your skin, where it can really do damage. So always think about covering as much skin as you can when you're in the laboratory. And similarly, when you're choosing your shoes for the lab, shoes that you're going to wear when you have a laboratory class, make sure that you try to choose shoes that close as much as the foot of the foot as possible. Fully enclosed shoes provide the greatest protection from dropped objects, sharp objects, spilled chemicals, biological agents, etc. So always try to wear fully closed shoes if possible. Now let's move on to some of the actual more, let's say, noticeable personal protective equipment. The first thing that I will mention is I'm wearing a lab coat. And like I said, your lab course may not require a lab coat, but if they do, some things to think about. 100% cotton lab coats provide a little bit better protection in the event of a situation where you'd be working with open flames or flammable chemicals. The 100% cotton will do a little bit better than synthetic fibers. The other thing to think about is if you're working with flammables or open flames a lot, then your instructor may require a flame retardant lab coat. But again, that'll be up to them. Then, let's talk about safety glasses. If you are supposed to wear eye protection, then you may be asked to wear either basic safety glasses or even more protection with chemical splash goggles. Whatever you're required to wear, if there is eye protection required, make sure that you keep that on at all times while you're in the laboratory. Even taking off your glasses for a minute means that somebody walking by could spill their substance and get it into your eyes and cause damage. So always keep your glasses on, your eye protection on, while you're in the laboratory if it's required. And the last thing I'll mention are gloves. Now people tend to kind of let their guard down when they're wearing gloves. They think of these as just this ultimate protection, but you have to think maybe even more when you're wearing gloves, because you're wearing the gloves generally to keep substances away from your skin. But this in turn means that you can't be handling your personal items with gloves on, because as soon as you touch a cell phone or a pencil or a notebook that you're using, and then use that item again later after you've removed gloves, then you've just transferred that substance to your skin anyway. So you never want to handle personal items when you have gloves on. You also don't want to take gloves outside of the laboratory. Then you transfer any chemicals or substances to door handles or water fountains, which again we want to avoid. So always take off your gloves before you leave the lab and put on a new pair when you come back in. Lastly, how to remove them. So if you are using gloves, there's a specific way to remove those. First, grab the palm of one gloved hand with the other, and then pull that glove off, inverting it as you do. Once you've got it off, ball it up in the hand of your other gloved, or the remaining gloved hand, slide your ungloved finger underneath that glove, and pull it off, inverting it as you do. And then you end up with this nice ball of gloves where everything that was on the outside is now enclosed on the inside. This not only protects you when you're removing the gloves, but also when you throw them away in the garbage, it provides an extra layer of protection for our custodial staff. Now, most of your labs will have an attached lab classroom, or at least a lab classroom next to your lab. When you're in the lab classroom, you want to remember that the classroom space itself is not a laboratory space and should not be treated as such. For instance, I shouldn't be wearing my personal protective equipment when I'm in the classroom space, because anything that's gotten on my lab coat or gloves or whatever could then be transferred to this classroom environment. And these classroom environments are always open to students when there's not a class in session. And students should be able to come in here, freely use the space, and not have to worry about the hazards associated with the lab. So for that reason, don't bring personal protective equipment in here, don't bring gloves in here, and don't bring laboratory equipment or substances into these spaces. Notice that cubbies are provided in the lab so that you don't have to leave your personal items in the classes. Alright, so a few more safety tips to talk about, just general safety reminders in the laboratory. First of all, never bring food or drink into the laboratory environment. Secondly, know all of the exit locations from any space that you'll be working on should the need to evacuate arise. Along those same lines, make sure that you have covered the plan for where to go and what to do in the event of an evacuation with your TA or instructor. Also, you need to make sure that when you're working in a laboratory environment, you always have a plan for what you'll do if there's an emergency, whether that's someone spilling a hazardous chemical on themselves, a fire, or any kind of related emergency. If you've been thinking about what you might do, you're more likely to be able to act quickly and efficiently in the case of an emergency. Also, when you're working in a lab, you should know the hazards associated with the different substances that you're going to be using. You can look up the hazards associated with these substances by looking at what are called SDSs, or safety data sheets. And I'll be making another video that will show kind of what those are and how to use them. Make sure that you never work in an unsupervised laboratory. Make sure a TA or instructor is always present. And possibly the most important thing you can do from a safety standpoint, in terms of habits you can get into, is to make sure that you wash your hands before you leave lab for the day. And whether that's just walking over to use the classroom space and work up some data, or actually you're done with the experiment for the day and leaving, you should always wash your hands before you leave the laboratory environment. Again, my name is David Thomas. If you see me walking around the labs, feel free to stop me, ask me questions. I'm more than happy to help as I can. And I hope that you enjoy your laboratory experience in the great facilities that we have here at the Crocker Science Center.